Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are, and thank you for joining our COVID-19 discussion series. My name is Alison Gaffney, and I am the Executive Director for CNAR, the Canadian Network of Agencies for Regulation. With the announcement of late regarding the physical distancing, limiting travel, self-isolation, and other actions being taken because of COVID-19, we've created a virtual discussion series with the objective of bringing Canada's regulatory community together, whether you are a member or not a member of CNAR, along with our partners, suppliers, and supportive organizations. The objective is to share ideas and best practices for actions being taken during this very difficult time, which all of us could benefit, learning from other groups or other individuals within this community. We launched this series earlier this week with a discussion about examinations, which was extremely well received, with the participants, in fact, requesting a follow-up virtual discussion, which we are now in the process of organizing in the coming weeks. We will also be posting that discussion up on our website and into our social media channels. But let's focus on today, because today is our second virtual discussion, and it's focused on the most important asset of our organization and every organization, which is our people. First, before we start, I'd like to cover a couple of housekeeping rules. Because of the tremendous response we have received for these virtual discussions, we've set up panels. The purpose is to facilitate the discussion, make it as most informative for you, and to address some of the pre-meeting questions which you have already submitted as participants of this call. Secondly, all participants are muted. But you can pose questions or discuss via the chat feature, which you'll find in the bottom right-hand corner of your monitor, if you're not familiar with Zoom. And this call is being recorded, which we will then post, similar to our other discussions, in the coming weeks on CNAR's sites. Okay, so let's get started. I'm very pleased to introduce our esteemed panel. We have Claude Balthazard from the Human Resources Professional Association, HRPA, Daniel Wong, partner with the WeirFoulds law firm, and Natasha Danson with the Steinecke Maciura LeBlanc law firm. Claude will not only be one of our panelists today, but we've also asked that Claude act as our facilitator and moderator for this discussion. So Claude and the other panelists, thank you again for participating. And Claude, I'd like to hand it over to you to begin our discussion on managing staff effectively during COVID-19. Claude.
Well, thank you, Alison. Let's see. So here's a very simple process today. I'm going to ask some questions to our panelists. After each question, whichever panelist takes the question first, the other panelists will have a chance to weigh in as well, and I will also make some comments as well. So we reserve some time at the end for questions at the end of the presentations, and so for that there's the chat feature. In the sake of full disclosure, though, we should note that our esteemed panel members are counsel for employers as opposed to employees, and so at times we'll answer questions from that perspective. But the panelists would be available after to answer questions offline as well. So so feel free to reach out to our panelists after the webinar. So let's get to it. So maybe the first round would just be simply to ask our panel members, maybe starting with Natasha, what do you think are sort of the key human resource issues that professional regulators are facing as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Thank you, Claude, and hello to everyone. In answer to your question, I would say that we're seeing a lot of questions around staff adopting new technologies, maybe staff who are less familiar when it comes to working from home and working remotely. We're getting a lot of questions around how to keep employees engaged and productive. This is of particular concern for employees who are now working from home, where they also have children who are out of school. I would say that we're also getting a ton of questions around employee terminations and layoffs, some human rights issues that arise as a result of COVID-19. And I sense that those issues are also top of mind for many of the participants today, having had the benefit of receiving some of the feedback from the survey that was circulated. Those particular questions, unfortunately, at least speaking for myself, and I think for Dan too, may be more difficult to answer given that this is a broad audience, and given also that these are very case-specific questions. So I just wanted to sort of put that disclaimer to add to the disclaimer that you had mentioned, Claude, that those particular issues are going to be difficult to respond to today, to the extent anyone has questions. But yeah, certainly we are seeing a lot of questions around employee engagement and productivity, and I sense those are top of mind for the folks on the call as well.
So from my perspective, everyone, and again, good morning or good afternoon for those depending on your time zone. In addition to the points that Natasha has raised, all of which have been taking up quite a bit of my time as a result of the COVID-19 situation, I've also found that, in fact, where a lot of my practice, and my practice is generally in representing employers on pure employment legal matters, what I find is interesting, and actually I quite enjoy, is that I am getting more involved in the practical aspects, and I think a lot of those will come out in today's presentation. For example, working with clients on ensuring that there are flexible arrangements, or that the work parties take a flexible approach to the situation. What I mean by that is, for example, when work is done during the day. So because of, as Natasha mentioned, childcare arrangements, or even just logistics, there may be some employees who are fighting for space at home to actually work, or they may only have limited resources, even tech resources. So things like that have been arising from certain clients. So I've been working with them on how they can be flexible, how they can communicate that to their employees, how they can work with their employees to make sure that the work is done in a productive way, and that the employees remain engaged. I think also too, another issue that from an HR perspective is ensuring that employees are properly trained and are provided with the necessary resources so that they can perform their work. And the limitations on an organization's ability to make those resources available or deliver training in an efficient and effective way. Another key HR area that can have some legal implications but are primarily practical are the employee well-being issues. So how often are people, are organizations connecting with their employees? How are employees connecting with each other? Those are other HR issues that I've seen as a result of the pandemic.
Thank you, Dan. Yeah, from a human resource perspective, it seems to me that the key thing is that we've got to get through this together, and that employees are probably the most important part of the solution. There's like both challenges and opportunities here. We're asking a lot of our employees. We're asking them to use new tools, new technology. We're asking them to work remotely, often dealing with kids at home, spouses who are also in the same situation of working remotely. We're dealing with significant disruption in business processes. So for example, the exam cancellations, the webinar the other day, virtual hearings, asking our employees to deal with new processes. Some workplaces have more support for remote work, more enablement that way than others. So we're going to have to tap into the resourcefulness of our staff to pull it all off, because that's how these problems and issues are going to be solved. We have to consider new approaches. But the downside is that takes a toll. We have to consider sort of resilience, avoiding burnout, avoiding isolation. And we're still early days, right? It's still sort of, for many of us, the second or maybe third week working remotely. And the worst apparently is still to come in terms of before we get to the other side of this. So my main points, we're going to have to take care of each other. Communication is key, and leadership is important. Having said my bit, now how about Dan? How about maybe talking about, you mentioned health safety issues. Can you say a bit more?
Sure, Claude. So from health and safety, what I'm referring to are primarily the issues and obligations of the workplace parties arising out of the occupational health and safety legislation. So each province will have its own version of that legislation. I'll be speaking from the Ontario perspective, but by and large, I would imagine that the comments are transferable and applicable regardless of which jurisdiction you may find yourselves in. So at a high level, in Ontario, it's unclear to what extent the health and safety obligations of the parties will apply where work is done remotely or at home. The Ontario Ministry of Labour Training and Skills Development currently doesn't have any guidelines or publications regarding the health and safety implications of telecommuting or working from home. I will point out that there is a provision in the Ontario health and safety legislation that appears to exempt work performed in private residences. Now, however, having said that, given the increase in remote working arrangements, either in the near term because of COVID or likely post-COVID, we may see more guidance on this issue from the Ontario Ministry of Labour. So for now, though, I think in taking a practical approach to health and safety considerations from working from home, I think my suggestion would be that the workplace parties should focus on a couple things. Number one, productivity. So does the employee have the necessary resources and training to perform work at home safely? Now, by and large, if you're a manufacturing employee, you probably aren't going to be working remotely from home. But for this audience and for regulators, and given what regulators generally do, most, if not all of the employees will have the ability to work from home. So working safely and productively will be important. As I mentioned previously, also wellness. So although wellness, strictly speaking, isn't expressly covered by health and safety, in my view, employee wellness is a health issue. And so the consideration for the workplace parties is the employer checking in with employees on a regular basis, both for productivity and for well-being purposes? And as well, from the employee's perspective, is there anything that an employee should be doing proactively to make sure that an employer is aware of any questions or concerns regarding health and safety or productivity issues that they may be facing?
Natasha, you want to add anything to that?
I just would say that I support the practical approach that Dan has set out. And in terms of avoiding health and safety issues, and really all issues in a remote workplace, I think that good communication is extremely important. I know we've all mentioned that already. But I think it will go a very long way when it comes to avoiding any workplace health and safety issues and issues generally.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting because, even working remotely, there's all sorts of small issues that come up. So for example, a lot of employees sort of brought their laptops, right, from work and can work at home. But laptops, if you actually spend as many hours with a small keyboard hunched over, right, we're not quite as well designed for sort of as sort of the main daily system. So let's see how that plays out. Natasha, you mentioned in your opening comments confidentiality in terms of, because one of the aspects of regulatory work is we deal with a lot of confidential files, confidential information, and so what? Working remotely, either through getting that information through a system or sort of having these files on one's laptop. What do you think?
Well, I agree that confidentiality is, I think, top of mind for most regulators in regular times, so in non-COVID times. Most regulators are governed, or most regulators that are governed by public statutes have very strict confidentiality provisions that are set out in legislation. Those provisions require that regulatory information be kept confidential, subject to a few exceptions. And in the legislation, or in a lot of those pieces of legislation, it's an offense to breach confidentiality, which carries with it pretty hefty monetary consequences. And thinking through confidentiality in this COVID, in this time of pandemic, I think it can be very hard to maintain confidentiality when working from home spaces are shared. So Dan already mentioned this, but I understand that it's quite common for an employee to be working from home from, let's say, a kitchen space, which is also their dining room space and also their living space, and that space may also be shared with a spouse. And employees are going to have to be extra careful to maintain confidentiality in those instances where it may not be as easy to do so. Some practical tips that we've been thinking about involve putting documents away at the end of each day in a safe and secure location, or at least in a dedicated spot, maintaining a pile of documents that can be cross-shredded when circumstances allow the employee to use a shredder at the office if they don't have a shredder in their home environment. But it's probably going to involve employees being proactive to raise any confidentiality concerns they have with their employers, and vice versa, the employer checking in with the employee to ensure that confidentiality is maintained, and come up with creative solutions when it comes to maintaining confidentiality in shared workspaces. And I would say also, with respect to confidentiality, the technology that a regulator is using can have an impact on confidentiality as well. So I know that a lot of our regulator clients have secure technology infrastructure in place. And recently, the Information and Privacy Commissioner of Ontario put out some tips that can be used to maintain confidentiality when working from home, which I think are quite helpful. The Commissioner set out some guidelines which include avoiding the use of personal email for work information. So avoiding that urge to maybe send emails to your Gmail account, for example. Avoid saving documents on the desktop of a personal computer or laptop versus sharing or saving that information on a shared drive through your work network. Always password protecting documents. I think that's a tip that many regulators are following anyway, but good to keep in mind, particularly now. password protecting devices, so laptops and phones. Again, I think that that's probably top of mind for many people already, but to keep doing that. Using initials to identify parties, especially where the parties are complainants. And then I thought this was a good one in terms of a tip, recognizing that we're all spending a lot more time in front of our screens now, to make sure before you hit send on an email that it's going to the right recipients. I anecdotally have seen a lot more emails that are being sent to the wrong people, and I do suspect that it's there's some fatigue associated with all the screen time that we're now experiencing. So I thought those were all good tips to keep in mind when it comes to protecting confidential information.
So just to add to that, not so much from a confidentiality perspective, but more from an information security and privacy perspective, I think the workplace parties should be also mindful of the increased risk of phishing and social engineering attempts, given that we're dealing now with work from home arrangements. So we have a dispersed workforce and who are already distracted, for example, by the public health situation, the unfamiliarity perhaps with the remote working arrangements, the ever-changing landscape in terms of news coming out, the ways your organization may be responding to those. There's just a lot of churn, a lot of things going on right now, and you want to watch out that some of the less scrupulous people in the world might be sending you emails in the time of uncertainty and frenetic pace that you might otherwise have caught with your spidey sense. That spidey sense might be a little bit diminished right now. So if you're an employee, you want to watch out for that. Probably err on the side of caution. Never hurts to follow up or send something to your IT department or to follow up independently with the supposed sender of an email, or pick up the phone. Never a bad idea. In fact, I've actually in the last week and a half or so have received a number of phishing attempts. So our firm has a very robust and comprehensive procedure that our IT folks have done a great job in educating and training us. So I'm like Pavlov's dog right now. So if I get one of those that's, forward to IT, is this legit? And they're very quick to respond saying, yes, it is, or no, it's not. Thank you for sending it to us. So you want to watch out for those too, because this is, in uncertain times, people can try to take advantage of you.
Yeah, it's actually quite tricky and evolving quickly. I was just, if you go to, for example, even the technology platform that we're on right now, Zoom, just recently identified some sort of confidentiality or sort of privacy breaches. In fact, there's a blog from the CEO of Zoom that just was posted yesterday or the day before in terms of what they found out and what they addressed. And actually a lot of it was just not so much with any ill intent. It was just that the platform was designed for large organizations and they never sort of had completely thought out all the implications of having all these individual users using it in the way that it's being used. So that's actually an interesting blog to read as well. So some of it is actually unintentional, and we're discovering these issues in terms of confidentiality that are embedded in some of the collaboration software that we're using. I just wanted to make a comment a bit quickly about anxiety and the fact that we're asking a lot and times are uncertain, and which is I mean, of course, it's a situation that's bigger than any single employer, which is sort of both good and bad, because we know that we're there's nobody that's not impacted by this, and we're sort of all in this together. And but some employees are impacted more than others, and some employees have more things going on than others, more things going on than we're aware of. So I think that's important in terms of, while we're getting the work done and using all these tools, that some of the aspects of having an office that are different from being remote is all these social connections and social chats that sort of are in and around sort of getting work done, and sometimes remotely it's harder to have a sense of where everyone is at. So it's more important to connect with, for example, all individual employees, and to be on the lookout for employees that sort of starting to drop out in a sense, participate less, or so for example, in a video sort of collaboration environment, sort of never allow the video, or there's it's also important to do the looping back, not only as a group or team or organization, but also individually as managers with all employees. And also the idea is to make sure that we're making full use of the whatever's provided for in our employee assistance programs and all that. But the idea is that there's some employees, especially if they have kids, parents, there's all sorts of reasons why, and also just individual resilience to be very mindful of that impact. And that's also important. And any comment on that?
Well, a couple further comments, Claude.
Yeah.
I think 3 words actually. I've actually shared this with a number of clients in when I'm helping them through situations, and the 3 words are: crisis reveals character. So, and that applies both to the employer and to the employee. So, how will each party to the employment relationship respond during this situation? Will they show resilience and support each other, or will their actions or inactions create anxiety? So I think it's something that's important for the workplace parties to keep in mind. This situation can be revealing about an organization or its workforce or individuals in the workforce. And that's kind of a very macro comment. But then when you drill down even to the individual level, we're having opportunities to learn more about each other in the workplace. We're seeing what's behind us. We're seeing what's in our home offices. We're hearing our kids. I've got clients who when they have their regular department or team meetings, they do themes. So they can have crazy sweater meeting. They can have put your kid on your lap meeting if you got a kid, or if you don't find a kid. All of these various things are ways that organizations can address and minimize the anxiety levels, increase resilience, increase productivity, engagement. So think outside the box as organizations. If you're in management, think of ways that you can lead by example. If you're an employee, I think most organizations, if not all of them, would welcome suggestions and feedback from individuals on how to make the workplace and how to make interactions more meaningful and more effective.
I just want to pick up on something that Claude said around the employee assistance program. So many regulators do have or do offer benefits to their employees, and as part of those benefit packages, there is often an EAP program or an employee assistance program. In addition to thinking about ways that the employer can support their employees directly, as Dan just mentioned, I think it's very helpful if you do have an EAP program in place to direct your employees to that, because that can, and there may be other benefits through the benefit package that an employee can avail themselves of, that I think employers and employees should take full advantage of during this time, because There may be a limit to how much support an employer can offer to their employees, but there are other resources available if you do have benefit programs in place, oftentimes.
Dan, what about legislative changes? How are they impacting your clients?
Oh, they are impacting them quite a lot right now. It's hard to believe that we're only talking about changes that have been implemented in a matter of the last 2 weeks or so. The pace at which these changes have been implemented, the magnitude of many of these changes is quite staggering. So I'm finding that employers are constantly in a reactive mode, waiting to or trying to make plans, trying to make decisions, knowing that the government has announced that something's coming in the very near future. So just hold on, working with clients and trying to figure out, can they hold on and wait, or should they just move ahead and hopefully be able to take advantage of or avail themselves to various forms of assistance. So it's a constant changing environment. I think the legal obligations from an employment and an HR perspective are constantly changing. One example is in Ontario, and I believe a similar approach has been taken in most, if not all, of the other jurisdictions. The Ontario government amended the employment standards legislation a couple weeks ago to introduce a job-protected, unpaid emergency leave called effectively emergency infectious disease leave. And it provides job-protected leave during the period where the provincial government has declared an emergency for very specific circumstances. Those include where an employee has been directed by public health officials pursuant to various government orders to self-isolate or quarantine, where an employee has an obligation or a need to look after someone who is either sick with COVID or who is in self-isolation or quarantine, childcare issues arising from the closure of publicly funded schools. So various circumstances that can give rise to an employee's ability to take this type of leave. Another key point is the government has also made it clear that an employer cannot require an employee to provide a medical note in connection with that type of leave. Having said that, however, that prohibition only applies to medical notes. An employer is still entitled to ask for evidence that's reasonable in the circumstances for reasons other than medical reasons. So if it's the closure of a daycare or an employee says, I need to take this leave because I have childcare obligations because my child's daycare is closed, an employer is entitled to have the employee provide some type of written confirmation or proof that the daycare has been closed, things like that. Another key legislative change is the essential businesses exemptions. Again, so in Ontario, the government has mandated the shutdown of businesses with the exception of businesses that are considered essential, and the government has implemented or passed a regulation identifying the various types of businesses. There's 74 businesses right now on the list, but the government has said that they will likely shrink that list further as another means to contain and stop the spread of COVID-19. In terms of some financial assistance, the federal government has announced a number of changes or new benefits. Those range from a work sharing arrangement through which employees can agree to share the work available and in exchange receive employment insurance benefits for any reduction in their pay as a result of sharing that work. The work sharing program generally has a 30-day waiting period, but as a result of the COVID-19 situation, the government has shortened that period to 10 days. In addition to work sharing, there's also the supplementary unemployment benefit program. which allows employers, if they choose to register their plan with the government, it allows them to provide top-up payments to employees who are laid off or unable to work and are in receipt of EI benefits. A registered subplan allows those top-up payments to be provided to an employee without affecting the EI benefits that they receive. Two other benefits available to the workplace parties. Very recently, as of I think it was yesterday or a few days ago, the government announced a wage subsidy program. It was initially released as a 10% wage subsidy for a limited number of employers or types of employers. I think in result from a lot of feedback from the business community and various stakeholders, the government has subsequently enhanced that subsidy, and now it's up to 75%, or a subsidy that would provide up to 75% of a portion of an employee's remuneration from March 15th to June 6th. And it's the greater of 75% of the remuneration paid up to a maximum of $847 per week, or the amount of the remuneration paid up to a maximum benefit of 75% of the employee's pre-crisis weekly remuneration, whichever is the greater of those. So that's something that a lot of employers that I've been working with are looking at and will likely take advantage of as a means to stave off any workforce reductions due to cost considerations. And finally, there's the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. This is the amalgamation of the two benefits that the government had previously announced regarding the emergency support benefit and the emergency leave benefits, emergency care benefit. So those things have been consolidated into the CERB, which will provide eligible employees with $500 a week for up to 16 weeks. The CERB is generally available to those individuals who are not eligible for EI. So my understanding is for individuals who may not be able to work or are out of a job as a result of the situation, they can get one or the other, but not both benefits at the same time. And the government apparently is targeting the beginning of next week for when applications can start for some of those benefits. So I think it's going to, the government, to its credit, has done, I think, a phenomenal job of implementing a lot of these changes in a fairly short time period. I had read an article earlier this week when the government actually had delayed releasing some information about the wage subsidy program because they were still working through all the details, and the reality was they're trying to hammer out the terms and conditions and think about this program over a matter of hours, when it's something that would ordinarily take the government months to finish. So I think they're doing the best they can, but I do anticipate that there will be some hiccups in the application process. There's probably going to be a lot of questions and uncertainty about the terms and conditions of the wage subsidy program or the emergency response benefit. But again, I think those are things that are in place right now and are steps that the government is taking to address and try to keep the economy going and minimize the effects to the workplaces.
Okay, well, yeah, it's changing daily, isn't it? The support and relief for both employers and employees. In the meantime, I guess we also got to keep the wheels rolling and getting the job done. Natasha, what about maintaining productivity?
Right. I think, and I know from the survey results that many of you have seen changes to your productivity levels and dips to productivity, which I think makes a lot of sense given that we're all working in new environments. I think that there are several steps that can be taken to improve productivity. steps that can be taken both by the employer and the employee. I think that the main sort of tip is just to coming back to communication, the importance of communication, to review what's being done and what cannot be done, what tasks are going to be feasible to tackle from home versus what tasks are going to have to wait. Being very clear on what the expectations are, setting those out very clearly. And then also, I think in terms of productivity, check-ins can go a very long way. So I know in the chat feature, there have been some comments around apps or different platforms that are being used for check-ins, and the importance of checking in both about work, but then also just generally to see your colleague's face can be very motivating. So I would say that's going to go a long way in helping to improve productivity in the workplace.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess one comment I wanted to make sort of on a different topic also is just the opportunity of leadership. You know, through all these changes, anybody that is in a position of management or not, just employees in terms of leadership. I guess, what was your expression, Dan, that crisis reveals character?
Yeah.
And I think that applies not only, if you want, to the character of the organization, the character of employees, but also the character of management and leaders. And the notion that, you know, leadership is very important. I was thinking about what sort of maybe the aspects of leadership that may be most important in a situation like the one we were having. And one, I think, is a sort of a certain optimism, right? I mean, that's important. And the ability to sort of focus on what's important and bring back the focus to what's important. Sort of kind of maintaining sort of always the values, maintaining the sort of the why are we doing this. And there's also a certain, I think, forgiveness that's necessary at these times, in a sense of that, you know, we're all dealing with difficult changing situations. So those were my thoughts, maybe just in terms of leadership. And also, it's interesting, you watch, I mean, this is more sort of personal, I guess, but, you know, it's impossible these days not to watch TV and see all these people who are leaders in their own sphere domain, either from the medical, the, you know, political, and sort of see how they handle the situation and sort of try to learn sort of some of the best practices from those individuals. Thoughts, ideas?
I agree. I agree. Well said.
So to actually, you know, in speaking with the leadership of various clients that I have been working with over the last few weeks, some practical tips that I've shared with them can be captured in two words. The first one is certainty. And I know that sounds like a very unusual word in these uncertain times, but what I mean by that is, to the extent possible, leadership should make its communications, or make sure its communications provide as much certainty as possible. So for example, even if it's certainty as to a date for the next update, I think that can be very meaningful to the workforce, because at least they know that when is the next touch point, when will there'll be an update, and so how long can I expect at least the current situation to last. So certainty on those, to the extent possible. The other comment or word that I would recommend to leadership is fairness. So in these uncertain times, there's a lot of decisions being made, a lot of things happening, a lot of moving parts. And so sometimes groups of individuals might be either unintentionally kind of lost in the noise, or may feel that they are lost in the noise. So making sure that any decisions being made, any communications, not only are they clear and certain to the extent possible, but there's fairness that it permeates through those decisions and communications, because I think that can help keep an organization together and can ensure that employees' engagement and their productivity remain as high as possible, while minimizing any anxiety at the same time.
The sort of, as we sort of turn a bit more sort of, yes, this will pass, and so we also have to think in terms of the decisions, and what we do today, right, has an impact in terms of how the organization will recover and sort of operate after this pandemic, or at least this phase of it will pass. Interesting in terms of one concept is sort of freezing and unfreezing, that you know, a lot of things now, you're mentioning the government sort of making decisions in days that usually would take months or never really get made. And a lot of things that we're doing as regulators is exactly the same thing, right? We're just sort of making decisions much more quickly than we in the past might have done, and that some of these decisions will have an impact well after, in the sense that some of these genies will not go back in the bottle. So for example, just the other day, and for the examination, so if we start going towards remote proctoring, then can we sort of ever pull back from that if we allow this? And so there's an interesting dimension, which is also to keep in mind of our decisions, how they will shape basically the post-pandemic world. Any thoughts, Dan, on post-pandemic?
Absolutely. So I think, you know, looking down the road, and once we get on the other side of this situation, I think employers will want to revisit their policies and procedures to ensure that they can and do apply to remote working arrangements. Mm-hmm. And that's whether those remote working arrangements will be part of a response to another situation, hopefully not in the near future, but should one arise, are you ready for that? Or perhaps it may be another outcome or long-term implication in and of itself, where organizations may move to a greater percentage or greater frequency of employees working remotely. Yeah. I know that there's been a few articles in the newspaper where various people have opined that commercial landlords are probably going to be taking a haircut and taking it on the chin pretty hard if organizations, or enough of them, start considering whether or not they are in a position to reduce their commercial footprint, because this situation has revealed that, in fact, some or a lot of the work can be done without the need to incur the overhead of offices or fewer offices. That may not work for all organizations, may not work for a lot of the regulators, but you know, those are some of the realities. I think also establishing organizations should consider, if they don't have one yet. I think this situation reveals the importance and need for things like business continuity plans. Mm-hmm. You want to have those. It's kind of like insurance. You have it and wish you never need it, rather than not having, wish you did. So when the dust settles, lessons learned and reflections from this situation can help inform an organization in fashioning or establishing their BCPs so that when, if and when, and I think let's be realistic, this is not going to be the last time something like this may affect your workplace or workplaces generally. So it's probably a good idea to make sure your organization has a BCP in place. I think that also generally, I think I can, in conversations with clients, there's been the sentiment quite commonly or quite frequently rather, where employers will likely want to ensure that its workforce is more flexible to allow it to adapt rapidly to unexpected changes in the future, whether it's as significant as something like a pandemic or not. Could be a weather-related closure. It could just be, hey, we sprung a leak, we got to shut this place down and everyone's got to go home for a week. Things like that. So you're looking at policies. You want to look at your contracts. I already mentioned your business continuity plans, but even things like cross-training. So will your HR practices now include an element of cross-training so that when people are working remotely or when changes affect your workplace, can you pivot or adapt quite quickly so that work can get done, enough people or the people who are available can get the work done. So that's another implication. And finally, I think employers will, again, when the dust settles and they have a chance to take their breath, they may actually be in a position to reevaluate, revise, or even redefine their business. I came across actually a Forbes article from earlier this week, and I'm just going to reference it. So it was the article talks about an organization that put out what's called the Future Workplace Survey, and the question was asked of HR leaders: how could the coronavirus be advantageous to your business? Now that's kind of an unusual question, but what the results came back were quite interesting. About 22% of the respondents said that this situation has prompted them to think of cross-training employees so that each of them have new skills. About 12% said that the situation actually may result in them creating new products and services for their business. Interestingly, a third of the respondents said that they're actually rethinking their business or their assumptions regarding their current business practices, and about 7% said that they didn't think it would be advantageous at all. So again, reevaluation, revising, and perhaps even redefining a business. Again, I recognize with regulators that may not be as relevant, but I think a long-term implication, even for regulators, is a bit of reflection and learning from this, and there may be some changes in practices and procedures.
Natasha.
I would just note, and this has been said, but these are early days. I think a lot of lessons are going to come out of this. There are some known unknowns, so how it's going to affect regulators' business continuity plans, work from home policies, etc. But I think there are also a lot of unknowns. I suspect that I know that there's going to be a lot of interesting legal and academic writing about this pandemic once the dust settles, generally, but with respect to HR specifically. And obviously, I think we'll all be monitoring that situation closely, because I'm not clear, I don't think anyone's clear on how long this is going to go on for and what the effects are going to be on the workplace. I see, based on what's coming in through the chat boxes, that there's some talk around reducing registration fees, and I think most regulators are going to see a decrease in the money that's coming in. We're getting a lot of questions around that, and I do sense that regulators are extending the deadlines to pay fees. Kevin, in response to your question though, and I'm curious to get Dan's take on this as well, I haven't heard of regulators applying for funding yet. or planning to apply for funding, but and I haven't looked into whether or not they'd be eligible for relief funding. But I think that's going to be a question that comes up for a lot of our clients, because there will be significant decreases in revenue based on the money that's coming in, because obviously regulators' membership base is going to be very affected by everything that's going on as well.
So on that, Natasha, I think to my knowledge, the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy is not available to public organizations, but it is available to not-for-profits and charities. So depending on the regulator and the nature, its nature, it may be available to them.
Yeah, and just thinking, so that would encompass, in Ontario at least, I think all the regulated health professions under the RHPA would all be not-for-profits. Most regulators are, so there may be some relief then.
Right. But I think there's still a lot of details that are still to come from the government in terms of eligibility and criteria. So, and I think I anticipate that they'll release that hopefully in early next week. So it's possible, even though we may not have seen any specific exclusions, that may be part of the next wave of details. So stay tuned.
Indeed, that's a whole topic that may require another webinar down the road, in the sense that depending on renewal dates and all that, as you mentioned, Natasha, some or most regulator will take some kind of hit to the bottom line. How much may be quite variable, or when, but that may force some difficult workforce decisions down the road. And so, because right now it's early, we're still in that sort of immediate shock response mode, but if revenues take a hit, then there may be difficult decisions to have to be made down the road.
Well, I think we're just about out of time. I don't know if you want to make any final statements, Natasha, Dan, and Claude.
I would just say thank you for attending. Thank you for inviting me. It's been nice to have an excuse to put on my face again.
Exactly.
And I would just say, just stress the importance of staying up to date, especially with respect to all the legislative changes that are happening. I know my firm has newsletters, a Twitter feed that's quite active, tracking all these changes. And I'm sure WeirFoulds is the same. So just stay up on everything that's going on, because it is tricky.
Yeah, I think, and yeah, just to build on Natasha's comment, WeirFoulds stuff is better. No, I'm kidding. But regardless of where you get the resources, my suggestion is, because it's happening so quickly, don't necessarily rely on the news reports. If you can, try to find, the official word, so to speak, from the government, whether it's a press release or the information on the federal government's website, because that should be the most up-to-date information. Because what you don't want is to be looking at something that's outdated. Again, things are happening so quickly, things get outdated in a matter of hours sometimes. So make sure you're looking at the right source.
HRPA, of course, regulates HR professionals, but a little secret here, we do have a web page where we pull together all the links to those things that you're mentioning, the regulations, the programs, and all that. They're original, of course, we collected them together as a resource to our registrants, but the web page is there, so it has a sort of a compendium of all of these. We try to keep up to date on everything that's coming out, and so that's another resource. So Allison, back to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everybody. I just wanted to say again, we will be posting this session on our websites or social media, and we will be sending out a questionnaire post-conference to get your feedback. on the session and what any follow-up you would like CNAR to help coordinate to support the group. So thank you again, panelists, very much appreciate it. And to you participants, we had over 100, almost 150 participants, so great session. Have a great day and stay safe, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Bye.